I'd just like to give a little introduction about Dr. Scharre. He's had quite the career, beginning with his service as a Special Operations Reconnaissance Team Leader in the Army's 3rd Ranger Battalion and completing multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He then shifted to the Office of Secretary of Defense, where he led efforts to establish policies on unmanned and autonomous systems, emerging weapons technologies, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance programs. Today, Dr. Scharre is considered to be one of the top 100 most influential people in AI by Time Magazine. Sir, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
Awesome. I'd like to start by talking about a central idea in your latest book. You define the current competition to rapidly develop and integrate emerging technologies by 4 key elements, which you define as 4 battlegrounds in your title. What are these 4 battlegrounds, and how does the U.S. stack up against China in these arenas?
Well, absolutely. Thank you. There's no question that the U.S. and China are in a major competition globally along many dimensions of military, political power, economic power, and technology is a key part of that. And certainly in artificial intelligence, both countries are working hard to maintain a competitive advantage. And when we look at prior disruptive technological shifts like the Industrial Revolution, we see that they changed the key metrics of power. So during the Industrial Revolution, coal and steel production became key inputs of national power. Oil, a geostrategic resource that countries were willing to fight wars on. So what is that in an age of artificial intelligence? And when I talk about it in the book, 4 battlegrounds, is these 4 key areas of competition between the US and China. Data, computing hardware, or computer chips, human talent, the scientists and engineers that are making these AI systems work and are integrating them into society, and institutions, organizations that are necessary to take these raw inputs of data, computing hardware, and human talent, and then turn them into useful applications, inputs or institutions like the Defense Innovation Unit, the Defense Department's outpost in Silicon Valley that the DoD has created to try to bring in AI technology. And China has their own copycat version. And so competition along these 4 dimensions is going to shape who leads an AI-driven future.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to touch on your point of institutions. I think another institution to consider here is the political parties and the way the government is structured and how the U.S. and China differ in that area tremendously. We look at the relationship between the private sector and government enterprises in China, and we see that that implementation and innovation is a much more streamlined process due to the party controlling both sides of things, but that's not how it works in the United States. So that being said, how would you characterize the relationship between government and private tech companies when it comes to integrating innovation and AI into United States security? What successes have you seen? And then on the flip side, what are the roadblocks to effective cooperation between the two?
Well, there's no question that the US and China have very different political economies, particularly when it comes to tech innovation and adoption. And one of the things that we've seen the US government do recently, I think is a smart move, is take a page not really from China, but from America's own history in the 60s and 70s, where after Sputnik, the United States made huge investments in science, technology, innovation here in the US. And that federal government investment has waned over the ensuing decades. And we've seen through things like the CHIPS and Science Act, a $280 billion investment that the government is making in science technology, a new reinvigoration of accelerating American innovation. And the role that the government can play that's constructive here is in setting up an ecosystem that's conducive to innovation, funding basic R&D that companies may not be incentivized to do, streamlining processes for high-skilled immigrants to come to the United States. So if someone's coming, with a Ph.D. in electrical engineering from India, we want that person to come to the US. And right now, there's a lot of barriers for them to actually do that. And then giving space for private companies to innovate and be constructive. And China's in a different boat where, of course, the Chinese government plays a much more active role in industrial policy. Their model has worked pretty well for the last several decades. China has seen unprecedented economic growth, and it's led them to a place where they are a global technology power. But recently, we've seen the Chinese Communist Party start to clamp down on tech companies inside China, emphasizing political control over economic growth, I think China actually has some difficult choices ahead. Obviously, their economy is in a tough spot at the moment, and there are some broader structural challenges that they're going to have to grapple with.
So you're clearly an expert on the innovation and emerging technology side of things, but something interesting about your career is that you've also experienced conflict firsthand through your deployments. And I was wondering if you could speak to that perspective and the nature of warfare that you've experienced in your past. Do you think that artificial intelligence has the potential to change the nature of warfare itself?
I think in the long run, AI could. And certainly my experiences as an Army Ranger, I did 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan during the wars, shapes how I think about technology. Mostly, I should say, it makes me a skeptic, which maybe sounds surprising for someone who's written now 2 books on autonomy and AI. I work a lot on technology now and how it's shaping the military. But I don't forget that, when I was a grunt down there in the mud, I was pretty skeptical of technology for good reason, because the military environment is very demanding, and our service members need things that are going to work, not just in a lab, but out in the real world, not just sometimes, but all the time when people's lives are on the line. I think in the long run, we're going to see that AI is going to have very profound effects on warfare. We're already seeing it in Ukraine, that AI is being integrated into drones, for example, that are being used on the front lines of Ukraine. And that process is accelerating over time. And the changes over the long term could be quite profound in terms of changing certainly the character of warfare, but even perhaps the nature of war itself as we begin to fundamentally change humans' relationship with war.
Going off of the human relationship with war, there seems to be a simultaneous concern with autonomous weaponry and the idea that the moral and ethical considerations inherent in human decision-making may no longer have a place on the battlefield. So to what degree do you think humans must be involved when it comes to the use of either AI or autonomous weapons, and how do we find a consensus on where to draw the line on autonomy?
Well, I think humans should be involved, and I think certainly humans need to be involved for legal and ethical decision-making. And there may be, specific, tactical things that we could delegate to machines that are fact-based decisions, but ultimately decisions about taking a human life, about using force in combat, those are human decisions. And in many ways, those are the essence of the military profession. What the military profession does is make decisions about the use of force. And so both from I think from a moral standpoint, but even from a military professional ethical standpoint, it's important to have humans still involved in those decisions. But there isn't any international agreement. So you're to a point about consensus. This is very much an open question about what other countries are going to do. The U.S. has been extremely forward-leaning on this issue. The U.S. policy on the role of autonomy in weapons dates back to over a decade now, back to 2012. So long before people were talking about ChatGPT and the front pages of the New York Times. And the military's been pretty forward-leaning on putting together policies internally for how to use this technology. But we don't have the same insight into what, say, China is doing. And that is a real concern when we think about what does this landscape look like going forward, because it's a competitive situation, and other countries get a vote too.
So that brings me to my next point, and you kind of touched on this already, is more the international cooperation side of things. Now, you've worked on DoD Directive 3000.9, which handles the internal regulation of autonomous weapon systems. But do you think, is there a path forward to international policy on this, and even like a way to enforce these regulations that might occur in the future?
Well, in terms of military AI, the U.S. has been working with other countries to try to get countries around a statement of principles to agree on some basic ideas about the role of keeping humans in decision-making for things like autonomous weapons. This would, what the U.S. military has proposed is a very strict requirement on our most dangerous weapons, nuclear weapons, that humans are always in the loop for any critical decisions relating to using or informing the president about a decision for the president to make about using nuclear weapons. But we haven't seen other countries adopt that. And I think it's very much an open question about whether we'll get other countries on board. And that's something that is an active area of diplomacy for the US government right now.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to wrap up our discussion by shifting to a different piece of emerging technology, one that I take particular interest in. Over the past decade, we've seen China's use and export of digital surveillance infrastructure for the purposes of censorship and repression. But is the abuse of digital surveillance technology limited to authoritarian states influenced by China, or do you think that illiberal and even liberal democracies are at risk of using this technology to, say, undermine individual freedoms in civil society? And if so, what steps should be taken to mitigate this risk to democracy?
I think it is a concern, and I think it's a concern because it can be an insidious threat where we start to see, a creeping spread of more surveillance technology in public spaces and even in our homes and our private lives, and we may not realize how quickly we're giving up our freedom and our privacy. Now, in democratic societies, there are checks and balances. There are ways for people to push back against this. In fact, we've seen a grassroots movement in cities and states across America against things like law enforcement using facial recognition. And I think that there's a lot of value in us having that debate as a society, and wherever someone falls on the spectrum of what those choices should be, in democratic societies, we have a legitimate process for sorting that out and for including different components of society in those conversations. Members of civil society, the general public can get involved. That's not true in authoritarian states, where China has been, as you pointed out, pioneering this very dystopian surveillance state to monitor and track its citizens, and then exporting that technology and China's laws and norms about surveillance abroad to other countries. Over 80 countries have purchased Chinese policing and surveillance technology, and we're increasingly seeing Chinese-style laws being replicated in other countries around the world. I think it's very troubling, and it's really important that democracies get together to set up the rules for ourselves and then to push back globally against the spread of digital authoritarianism to protect freedom and privacy around the world.
Thank you, sir. It was wonderful insight, and this concludes the moderated portion of this session. Do we have enough time for a couple questions? No? All right, I apologize, everyone. Just to get back on track, we're going to have to cut the Q&A portion of this session, but, sir?
It's an afternoon of audibles here, so I think Megan's will be making her way down anyway. We got time for a question or two. Where's the question?
Great.
Let's do at least one.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
No pressure now for whoever's asking the question.
I'll keep that in mind. Good afternoon, Doctor. My name is Second Class Yakitis from the Coast Guard Academy. It's well known that AI has many negative consequences in the security context. And while many of these are credible threats, what do you believe is the biggest misconception or red herring about AI in this context?
I don't think that people necessarily know yet how bad the security threats are from the most capable AI systems. Even the best AI scientists don't know. And so, for example, the successor to ChatGPT, GPT-4, that came out earlier this year, was shared by OpenAI. You could access it online. Some scientists from Carnegie Mellon found that they could get this model, this AI system, to generate the steps needed to synthesize chemical weapons. So if you said to it, I want to make a chemical weapon, I want to make, mustard gas or VX gas, how do I do that? This AI model had the knowledge, the chemistry knowledge, to tell you what chemicals to mix. And then these scientists found that there are these remote labs, remote cloud labs that are connected to the internet, where someone can send in code and do scientific experiments. And they asked the model to generate the code to make these chemical weapons. And the model had the ability to do that. And so that's deeply troubling when we think about the spread of these technologies. Now, these scientists didn't go make chemical weapons, and OpenAI is controlling their model. So if you go ask it now to do that, it'll say no. But as we see these technologies spread more widely, they're going to democratize access to this kind of destructive capabilities. Another leading AI lab, Anthropic, who also has a very advanced system equivalent to something like GPT-4, they said that they've done private tests with experts in biology and biological weapons who've said that they think that their model could be used by someone to accelerate that person's ability to build biological weapons, make it easier for someone who may not have a PhD in biology to know how to do this, to be able to build these kind of weapons. This is really troubling, and we need to find ways to come together, not just in the US, but globally, between other countries, between governments and industry, to find ways to manage the proliferation of this technology. Because once the cat's out of the bag, there's not a good way to wind that back. And I think that is a big concern. It's one that's moving very quickly, and we're going to have to find ways to accelerate the policy development to control proliferation just as fast.
All right, good question. And with that, I think we will leave it there. Sorry for the little bit of a bridge session there, but let's please show our appreciation to Paul and Trinity for giving us a dose of AI. I know I'm going to read the papers a little bit differently, or do we read papers anymore? I don't know. Is it a news feed? Is it a paper? It all gets a little bit confusing. So thank you very, very much.